Well, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, I think the weather was a bit of a help, but yeah, no, I really am overwhelmed by the fact that we have almost filled the room. Uh, yeah, because you know that don't I know? I mean, economics is a boring subject, and yeah, as you can see from the picture, this book is literally the first book in the revived Pelican series of paperbacks. I think people of certain age that remember those books. Well, talking about really everything from the universe to ants. Yeah, actually, I looked it up. There was a book on ants, economics to bird watching, and from philosophy to design. So it was a very important way of introducing people to a range of topics from a non-specialist point of view between the 1930s and 80s, and Penguin has decided to bring it back, and I'm very honored to be one of the first authors. Now, in this book, I try my best to dispel this widespread perception that economics is too complicated for non-economists. Well, but think about it. It's very interesting because I bet, as I do, you have very strong opinions about just about everything under the sun, yeah? Gay marriage, women priests, Iraq, Afghanistan, global warming, nuclear power stations, without having any necessary technical qualification to make a reasoned judgment. No, seriously, what do I know about the international relations? I took one course back in 1983, Introduction to International Relations, when I was a university student in South Korea. But then I have a very strong opinion about Iraq. How dare I? Yeah? However, when it comes to economics, it's very different because a lot of people say, "Oh, it's too complicated. It's not for lay people. Let the specialists, all those." Clever guys in the Bank of England and the Treasury and the International Monetary Fund take care of it. But why? No, we have to ask this question. Yeah? I mean, of course, the interpretation is that my professional colleagues have been fantastically successful in convincing other people that the subject is so difficult that you don't understand it even if we try to explain it to you. Yeah? So trust me, I'm an economist. I know what is good for you. But, I disagree with them. I believe that 95% of economics is common sense. Of course, made to look difficult, with the use of mathematics and jargons. And even the remaining 5% can be understood in its essence, if not in all technical details, if somebody actually bothers to explain it in an accessible way, which is what I try to do in this book. Excuse me. So the book actually tries to offer something completely different, as Monty Python used to say, because it is that you may not like the book, but I can tell you that it is different. Yeah? Look at the table of contents. It talks about a lot of things that economics books these days don't normally talk about. Actually, very few books even bother to explain what economics is. There's very little about the history of capitalism, and very few of them would actually tell you that there are different schools of economics or different approaches to economics. Also, the book discusses topics that are mentioned but not seriously discussed, like work and production. So I'll explain what I do with these things, but I'm just showing you the table of contents. My book also introduces people to lots of, what I call real life numbers. We have this the impression that economics is a numbers subject. Actually, if you know anyone who's graduated with a degree in economics, grab that person, ask him or her, do you know what is the total output of the world economy? Do you know how much of that is produced by the United States or China? Do you know how long people work in Germany as compared to Greece? They'll have no idea. Yeah? No, because we don't teach these things. Yeah? Now, you could argue that, well, why do you need to those numbers? Theory is more important. Well, I'll tell you why. Because not knowing these real life numbers can seriously mislead you. In the Eurozone crisis, well, I mean, it's still going on in a way, but at the height of it, there's this very popular narrative coming out mainly from Germany, basically arguing that, all these Mediterranean types like the Greeks, I mean, they are just lazy, yeah? Good for nothings who try to leech on hardworking Germans. Huh? Yeah, I mean, this had a very strong appeal. But when you actually look up the statistics, the Greeks work 40% longer than the Germans. Greeks are actually the hardest working people in the rich world, except for the South Koreans. Yeah? But then we are supposed to be the worker ants. Yeah? Greeks are supposed to be lazy, but they work actually almost as long as we do. Yeah? So the problem with Greece is that of productivity, not work ethic. Yeah? But once you have misdiagnosed the problem as a problem of work ethic and morality and so on, then you are looking at the wrong things. Yeah? I mean, the European Union should think about ways to raise the productivity of the Greek economy rather than hectoring them with moral preachings about having to work hard and so on. Yeah? So these numbers, really matter. I mean, of course, in this internet age, you don't need to remember any of these numbers because you can always look them up like that. But even just to know what to look up, you have to have some feel about these numbers. And this is what I try to do in the book. But while emphasizing the importance of numbers, I also argue that numbers always need to be taken with a pinch of salt, sometimes with a bag of salt. Yeah? The German author of Faust, and he was also a scientist, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said that everything factual is already a theory. And this really applies to numbers, I mean, all numbers, but especially in subjects like economics. Yeah? Because all numbers are constructed on the basis of a particular theory. Yeah? So you hear about GDP all the time. Yeah? GDP, roughly speaking, measures the output of an economy, but it actually is based on a very particular definition. So, for example, unpaid household work or care work done by family members are not counted, despite the fact that this is estimated to be around 30% of the whole economy. I mean, if everyone hired people to do their household work, we would immediately add 30% to our GDP. Yeah? Now, you could argue whether this should be included, shouldn't be included, but one thing is clear. By not including this work, mainly done by women, we are hugely devaluing the contribution of women to the economy. Yeah? You can debate whether this is a useful measure or not, but it remains absolutely certain that it is measuring output in a very particular way. Look at unemployment figures as well. You hear that unemployment has fallen, risen, but what do they actually mean? In order to be counted as unemployed, you should be willing to work. So there are a lot of people who are totally capable of working, but who are not willing to work, like the university students. Yeah? Yeah, we used to call them parasites, but now, how do you prove that you are willing to work? You actually, according to this standard methodology, you should have applied for a paid job in the last 4 weeks. But why 4 weeks? Why not 2? Why not 6? Why not 8? Yeah? Well, once again, you can debate, but you have to remember that. But more important the implication of measuring willingness to work in this kind of way is that it excludes the so-called discouraged workers, workers who have made 250 applications, totally got fed up with the process, and now have given up. They are willing to work, they want to work, but they have got exhausted by the process. This may not be such a problem during normal times, but in times like this, with the recession, it is a very important difference. Yeah? Makes a very important difference. So, according to some estimate, at the height of the 2008 global financial crisis, something like you could add something like 6% point to the U.S. unemployment if you counted these discouraged workers. Yeah? I mean, the official unemployment rate at the height was like 10%. Some estimates show that it could have been 16 if you included all these discouraged workers. Yeah? Anyway, I'm not saying that one way of measuring this or the other way is more correct than the other, but you have to know how these numbers are constructed. Yeah? Of course, we tend to treat numbers like sausages. Yeah? You don't want to know what has gone in there. Yeah? But you have to know this. Yeah? Now, many economists will tell you that economics is a science in which there is only one right theory, or at least one best theory. But in this book, I devote a whole chapter, a rather long one, to explain that there are at least 9 different major schools of economics, several more if you include the more minor schools. And for free market economics alone, I have highlighted those 3. For free market economics alone, you have 3 schools: classical, neoclassical, and Austrian. Yeah? So how come, if it's science, there are 3 different theories supporting the free market? Yeah? At least you think that if they are supporting the same thing, there will be one theory. No, it's not like that. Yeah? And I argue that in order to understand the world better, the real world economies better, we need all these different theories. I have split them into schools not to create schisms and fighting. I have created this list to show that there are different ways of understanding the economy, each with their strengths and weaknesses. Yeah? And they focus on different things. The classical economists were as supportive of free market as the neoclassical economists, but they were more interested in production and productivity, whereas the neoclassical economists are more interested in market exchange. Yeah? So they look at different things. In the understanding the real world, recognizing its complexity and the inevitably partial nature of these theories, we need to have all these theories working together. And to explain this, I give you the Singapore problem, which is that if you read about Singapore in standard accounts, the Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal, you'll only hear about the fact that Singapore has free trade and has a welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. Yeah? But you will never be told that nearly all the land in Singapore is owned by the government. 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of national output is produced by state-owned enterprises, including world-famous Singapore Airlines. Huh? In the world average in this regard is only about 9%. Yeah? So in relative terms, it has a state-owned enterprise sector 2.5 times bigger than normal. So I often put it to my students, give me one economic theory. Doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Marxist, Keynesian, one economic theory that can explain Singapore, and there isn't such a theory, because this is a very unique and pragmatic combination of some extremes of socialism and capitalism. So we need all these different theories to work together. I mean, they used to say that we should let 100 flowers bloom, but I would argue that we need to have them cross-fertilize to create more ideas. So in this regard, my advice is that you should not become the proverbial man or a woman with a hammer who sees everything as a nail, and starts banging everything. No, it will work if you happen to be banging at the nail, but it will be a disaster if you are banging at an egg, or a vase, So you need to get the Swiss Army knife, of economics, different tools, different approaches, so that you can apply different things to different contexts. Okay, I mentioned earlier that my book deals with a number of topics that are usually not discussed in economics books. Let me talk about just one of them, that is work. Most people of working age spend at least half of their waking hours in work, and a lot more if you count the commuting hours. Actually, if you're some unlucky black guy living in one of the townships in South Africa, these are kind of second-rate cities that the apartheid regime built far away from the main cities, you could be spending actually 6 hours a day just commuting. Because the apartheid regime deliberately didn't provide public transport there, and the following ANC regime hasn't really done much to correct this situation, so these people have to rely on these minibuses that are strangely called taxis in that country, run by criminal gangsters, charging on arm and a leg, traveling on very poor road, because that's the only way to get to work and come back home. So that we are spending enormous amount of time actually working, but you read most economics books, I'm not saying that all of them are like that, but most economics books, they don't talk about work. Because the dominant economic theory of our time, the so-called neoclassical theory, mainly theorizes people as consumers. So work is what they call a disutility that they have to put up with so that they can earn money with which they can buy things and services, consuming which gives them utility. So work is an inconvenience. At best, it's a means to an end, which is consumption. But actually, what happens in a workplace fundamentally affects us. Not just our immediate physical and psychological well-being. If you are exhausted from your work and so on, that you feel less happy and so on, but also it affects our sense of identity. We used to call ourselves by our profession in the old days. It also gives a sense of self-worth. A lot of studies show that what really gets at unemployed people is not just the economic hardship, but the sense that they are now not needed by the society anymore. Yeah, and indeed, these days, a lot of people in the rich countries feel less happy despite having higher income than, say, 20 years ago. Why? Well, it's not the only reason, but I would argue that one major reason is that their work lives have become more stressful. So work intensity has increased. There's a greater psychological pressure to perform because of the various performance-related pay and so on. I mean, I'm not saying that performance-related pay is bad in itself, but very often it is used in a way to just measure certain very tangible things and ignore quality and so on. People get extremely stressed about fulfilling those targets. Now we have longer and more crowded commutes. More importantly, we have much less job security than in the old days. So we are feeling miserable, but then economists come and tell you, look, you should be happy. Your income is 20% higher. This is because they don't take into account work in measuring people's standard of living. Because we don't just live by consuming. Yeah, and unfortunately, this is has become so widespread that even the Labor Party, the party of workers, are now talking about the cost of living crisis, not about general living standard crisis. Okay, throughout the book, I emphasize that economics is a political subject. Now, today, economics is dominated by the so-called neoclassical school, which really doesn't want to talk about politics, so much so that when it was first founded in the late 19th, early 20th century, it actually renamed the subject. Economics used to be called political economy. This is what Adam Smith and David Ricardo wrote about. They didn't write about economics. They wrote about political economy in clear recognition that economics and politics are inseparable. But at the turn of the last century, the neoclassical economics, when it became dominant, said, no, we should make economic science, which means getting rid of ethics and politics, and we are going to rename the subject economics. So they have a great aversion to talking about politics in a explicit way. So the school tries to work with, well, at least what they think, what it thinks is a apolitical principle known as the Pareto principle. This is named after Vilfredo Pareto, who is a half Italian, half French economist who taught in Switzerland in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Pareto argued that, well, we have to use the principles that are as apolitical as possible to judge our economic outcomes. So he argued that we should define something on economic improvement at the social level only when it hurts no one and makes some people better off. Now, this was a very serious proposition because, to explain this, and this is one thing that is not in the book, so that you at least get something out of coming to this talk. I talk about the one finger problem. What it is this, someone tomorrow morning knocks on my door and says, oh, Dr. Chang, we found this wonderful technology that will solve the problem of global warming overnight. The machines are all ready to go, but we need one critical input, and that is one live human finger. Can you donate that finger? No, I'll gladly chop off my finger and give it to them. But what if it's my arm? Maybe I'll still do it. But what if it's my life? What if it's my family's life? What if it's 50 million Koreans? Where do you stop? So this the Pareto principle came out of a genuine kind of dilemma. I mean, it's not a frivolous doctrine. It is basically trying to defend individuals against the majority of against the tyranny of the majority. So it is a noble principle, but you cannot deny that this gives a huge weight to the status quo, because this means that however unjust and unequal the current state of the distribution of income and wealth may be, you cannot use any policy that will hurt one person, even if that person owns almost everything and everyone else is starving. So this principle gives a huge political bias to economic discussion. And even when they are not explicitly using the Pareto criterion, the dominant neoclassical school tends to accept a lot of things as given. The best example is this debate that Paul Krugman, the American economist, had with some American NGO activist in the late 1990s. You know, Krugman is probably as progressive as it comes for a neoclassical economist. But he had this debate in the late 90s with these social campaigners campaigning against American companies paying low wages in countries like Bangladesh. And Krugman intervened in this debate and said, look, you people are kind-hearted, but you are misinformed. Because you are talking as if these Bangladeshi workers have a choice between a low-wage job and a high-wage job. But the choice they face is between a low-wage job and no job. And given that no job is always worse than low-wage job, you should support this low-wage jobs in Bangladesh created by American companies. Yeah, he was absolutely right, except that he made this argument on the basis of accepting everything that is going on. So what if Bangladesh can have land reform, which will keep more people in the countryside, which will reduce downward wage pressure in the urban areas? What if Bangladesh can implement the laws that bans child labor that will reduce downward wage pressure? What if Bangladesh can use some kind of industrial policy to create high productivity and high wage jobs in new industries than just trying to live off cheap labor in textile industry? When these things happen, the choices are maybe actually between a high wage job and a low wage job, not between a low wage job and no job. Now, some of you might say, oh yeah, those are pipe dreams, but these are exactly things that happen in my native country in the South Korea in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We had land reform. We made primary education compulsory when our per capita income was $100, and we created a lot of new jobs in the high productivity industry. So, you have to make an implicit political decision here. Are you going to campaign for your government introducing some kind of minimum wage law or abolish child labor or have a land reform and so on? Yeah, if you are agreeing with Krugman, yes, you are making this implicit political statement that the current the arrangements in Bangladesh are acceptable and we can't do anything about it even if we don't like it. Maybe correct, but it's still a political judgment. Political nature of markets, economics goes even deeper. In my previous book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, I devote my first chapter to this issue. I mean, the chapter is called There is No Such Thing as a Free Market. Now, what I'm trying to say there is that the very boundary of the market itself is politically determined. And to give this example, explain this, I give the example of the regulation of child labor in Britain in the early 19th century. As you all know, child labor was a huge problem at the time. So in 1819, a group of reform-minded MPs in the parliament proposed this new law to regulate child labor. Now, by today's standard, this law was a joke, because it said it will only apply to cotton factories. Cotton factories at the time were the biggest problem because the technology at the time meant that a lot of dust was produced, which accumulated in the workers' lungs and killed off many of them. And especially children were very vulnerable to this industrial disease. So they said that we will apply it to cotton factories, which is a particular problem. So no mention of the Welsh coal mines or chimney sweeps in London. And he said that we will ban the labor only for very young children, below 8. And for older children, up to the age of 15, 16, I forget what the definition is at the time, we will restrict their working hours. To how many hours a day? Any guess? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this was a time when the ordinary older workers used to work 16, 17 hours a day. So this was considered lenient. Now, despite this being so kind of soft, a lot of the free market supporters got very upset. They said, "Oh, you can't do this. This is undermining the very foundation of a free market economy, namely the freedom of contract. These children want to work. These people want to employ them. What is your problem? It's not like these people kidnap these children and use them as slave labor. This is a free contract." Well, of course, this makes sense only if you believe that freedom of contract should have priority over the children's right to have a childhood and an education. But once you accept that premise, this isn't even seen as a regulation. I mean, how many free market economies in this country, at least, do you know who says we need to bring back child labor to truly free British labor market? Yeah, I mean, you go to Pakistan, you go to Ecuador, there are millions of children working there, totally legally. In India, the government labor survey counts the children as young as 5 years old as the part of working age population. So this is the stark reality, but then we don't even think that we have a regulation on child labor. I mean, I really don't know. Well, actually, there was one partial exception, Newt Gingrich. In the 2012 presidential campaign in the United States, where he was a candidate, he said poor children should work as janitors in their own schools. So that's the only exception that I can think of. I do not know any free market economies based in a rich country arguing that we need to bring back child labor. But then why not? So the point I'm trying to make is that what is a legitimate object of exchange in a market and part of the economy is actually politically determined. There's no reason why, according to any economic theory, that says we shouldn't have child labor. Why not have slavery? So all of these things are politically determined, and in that sense, economics just cannot be separated from politics. If some economist tells you that, oh, this is economics, that's politics, you have to tell him or her, look, that's your politics. This is my politics, and you dare to call your politics economics. Yes, so my book is not just an explanation of economic theories and facts. It's also a manifesto about the role of economics in public life. And in this regard, I have 3 sets of observations to make. Well, first, never trust an economist, and that includes me. Of course, this creates a Greek-style paradox. If you don't trust me, how do you trust that statement? Then you have to trust all economists. But I explain in greater detail in the book that professional economists do not have a monopoly over truth. There are 9 different opinions at least on the same thing. And it is actually entirely possible for people who are not professional economists to have sound judgments on economic issues. And actually, sometimes their judgments may even be better than those of professional economists because they may be more rooted in reality and less narrowly focused. And this is a very important point. Don't think that your opinion is inferior. And indeed, I would argue that the willingness to challenge professional economists on the part of the ordinary citizens is actually a foundation of democracy. I mean, it's not just about economists. I mean, every expert. If someone told you that, well, experts know what they do, so leave them alone, then why do you need democracy? Democracy works only when ordinary people have an opinion and demand a solution on so-called expert problems. Of course, I mean, experts are needed to get the details right, get balances right between different elements and so on, but they cannot tell you what is a better society. That has to come from the population. That is, to me at least, the foundation of democracy. Once you deny that, once you say that, what do politicians know, what do ordinary people know, bring in the economics professors, bring in the Bank of England officials, and they'll run the country for you. I think that we are running down a very, very slippery road. Yeah? The second point is, I haven't learned Latin, so I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce it. This is apparently what is written on the walls of the city hall of Gouda in the Netherlands, the city of cheese. So, I don't know how they found time to come up with something this clever during all those cheese making, but here you go. Listen even to the other side when you're debating. I'm not saying that you should not have a strong opinion of your own. You should. But you should always remember that given the complexity of the world and given the necessarily partial nature of all economic theories, you could be wrong. I mean, this is a very important thing to bear in mind. Finally, throughout the book, even while I constantly make reform proposals, I emphasize how difficult it is to change the economic reality. Now, sometimes the difficulty is due to the active attempts by those who benefit from the status quo, bribing, lobbying, media propaganda, even violence. But the status quo often gets defended even without some people actively being evil. Yeah? Because in a market system, the rule of $1, one vote rules. So people with less money are extremely constrained in terms of their ability of saying no to things they don't like. Yeah? I mean, Karl Marx put it dramatically. The choice in front of a worker is whether to work in a dangerous hard job at low wage or not to work and starve to death. Yeah? I mean, we don't live in that kind of situation today, but you get the point. Yeah? Moreover, people can be susceptible to beliefs that go against our own interests. Yeah? Some of you might remember in the days following the controversial American healthcare reform, the so-called Obamacare reform, you might have seen all these people demonstrating against Obamacare with placards like, "Government hands off my Medicare." Well, hello, the Medicare is actually a government program. Yeah? But these people have been brainwashed by the American insurance companies that the government health program never works, and therefore, Medicare must be a private sector program because it works. Yeah? Well, the Marxists used to call this false consciousness. Eh? Well, today we have a better word, the Matrix, after the movie. So because of all this, changing the status quo is very difficult, but this should not make you give up the fight to create a better economy and better society. Yes, changes are difficult, but in the long run, when enough people fight for them, many impossible things happen. 200 years ago, if you advocated abolishing slavery in America, you were considered a madman. Yeah? Because the slave-using cotton and tobacco industry were the main export industry of the United States. Yeah? So you would have been labeled at least unrealistic, if not worse. Yeah? 100 years ago, even this country used to lock up women for asking for vote. 50, 60 years ago, all the founding fathers of today's developing nations, well, including Israel, were hunted down by the British and French colonial authorities as terrorists. Yeah? But these things have all happened because people fought for it. So, I would agree with the famous Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who said that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, but I could do far less than quoting Nelson Mandela, who used to say that it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you. Right, I'll be very happy to chair my Q&A session. So yes, gentleman over here.
Yeah, thank you for your illuminating talk. Getting back to Greece and Germany, I read that a lot of the economy in Greece is based on cash. If you want an architect or a dentist, it's a cash. Whereas in Germany, there's an intense bureaucracy in collecting. So how can you compare a German economy with a Greek economy? And secondly, on productivity, a lot of the Greek economy depends on rural farming. They don't make Mercedes. So, you know, if we've got olives to pick or peaches to pick, you can pick them faster, but once you've picked them, the season's gone.
Yeah.
So what do you do with a country like Greece in terms of productivity?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me collect, say, 3 questions and try to answer them together. I think, yeah, that man over there. Okay, yeah. Well, I'll.
Is this on? You talk about change are difficult to make, even big ones are possible. When I look at the Arab Spring, especially Egypt, there's a country where they had a revolution, and now actually they've wrecked the economy, there's no tourist trade, and they're far worse off. So surely, perhaps you should preach for gradualism rather than revolution. I don't know what you say about that.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Hello. So the question is, has any economist ever changed their opinion in light of the evidence?
Right, thank you. Yeah, reacting to that first, no, actually there's one interesting episode in the life of John Maynard Keynes, the eminent British economist. You know, once in a debate he was accused of changing his mind by his opponent, and Keynes famously replied, well, when facts change, I change myself, my opinion. What do you do, sir? Yeah? So, yes, economists are known for not changing their opinions very easily, but no, I mean, actually, after the 2008 financial crisis, you've had some economists coming out saying I was wrong. And I mean, I really admire them because it's very difficult after having expounded on some idea for 30, 40 years of your career and possibly got a Nobel Prize on it and so on, and then coming out saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. So but this is a tiny minority. Unfortunately, you know, that hasn't happened. It's not just economics, you know, the famous German physicist Max Planck once said that science progresses one funeral at a time. Okay, on the question of revolution versus evolution, yes, I mean, I am of the view that evolution is far more effective than revolution because, you know, don't forget, I mean, those changes might have some kind of dramatic episodes, but they didn't happen overnight, you know. In between, I mean, going back to that child labor example, in between that first legislation and Britain effectively eradicating child labor, it took a century. You know, women's suffragette movement took decades to bear fruit and so on. So, yes, I mean that you know that some people who believe that one big upheaval and will sort out everything, I think I don't agree with that. But you know that sometimes things go forward and backward and so on. So it's difficult to say what happened in Egypt a few years ago was necessarily good or bad for the country in the long run. Now, Mercedes versus olives. Yeah, no, actually, you know, that's one very important point because you know, it's very difficult to increase productivity in agriculture. So, for example, Adam Smith had this famous example of pin-making factory. he, in the first chapter of his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, he argued that if you try to have one person to make a pen on his own, he can make maybe 1 pin a day, at most 20 pins a day, because he has to do everything, yeah? Draw out the wire, cut it, sharpen it. He said if you divide it up into 10 steps and have 10 people working on it together, you can actually produce his number, something like 4,800 pins per person a day. So he praised the importance of division of labor. And in the 1980s, a Cambridge economist called Cliff Pratton investigated British pin factories and found out that per each worker, they were producing 800,000 pins. Yeah? So if you actually calculate that increase in productivity between Adam Smith's time and the 1980s, and try to apply to wheat growing, someone should have already invented a technology that can grow wheat in 6 minutes instead of 6 months. No, this is the kind of contrast in the scope for productivity growth between agriculture and manufacturing. And yes, Greece relying on those things is finding it difficult to keep up the pace. I mean, they had a good time for a while because people were lending money to Greece as if it was Germany, but then you never solved that fundamental productivity problem. Yeah? So that's where they have to focus the attention rather than lecturing the Greeks that you are not working hard. Yeah? Yes, the lady over there.
Do you have any opinion on pooling money by linking it to some sort of standard like the gold standard that was removed?
Right, yeah.
As a mechanism of preventing excesses of booms costs?
Yeah.
A very domestic question. Could you say something about your views on the government intervention in the Help to Buy scheme and what its
Oh,
effect
right, yeah,
is?
yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, one more?
Yeah, could you comment, please, on your view about behavior economics and
Sorry?
behavioral economics
right,
and the interesting ideas put forward in nudge theory, for example?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Of course, the recent financial crisis has been created by the excessive credit creation. So the people have argued that we need to restrain this by tying it to gold or some other precious metal. Well, I mean, this idea has been tried. I mean, actually, the existence of the gold standard was one thing that aggravated the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s. The problem with tying it to gold is that gold supply is very difficult to increase quickly if the need arises. So I think we need something more flexible than gold. However, we can restrict credit growth by many other means. I mean, you could tell the banks that you cannot lend more than X amount of capital you have. You cannot lend more than X times of people's salary to lend them money to buy houses and so on. So there are other regulatory measures that you can use. So I completely agree with you that this credit growth has to be restrained, but I think tying it to gold is a bit too extreme. Yeah? Now that leads me to the Help to Buy. Yes, I mean, I think the problem with the current government approach to reviving the British economy is that, once again, I mean, this economy has a fundamental productivity problem. Since the financial crisis, the value of pound fell by something like 30%. You still have one of the biggest trade deficit in the world. You cannot make enough things that other people want to buy. Yeah? So how are you going to fix that? Focus should have been there, especially given that the crisis was created by this the financial industry. Unfortunately, it's a hard work, to make your industry grow again and innovate and so on. So the government has resorted to something that is the easiest to do, yeah? Give money people to buy houses, yeah? And then it will create a mini boom, and then we are going to face the same problem. So I'm extremely worried about this. Yeah? Behavioral economics, yeah, I mean, there is one of the main schools I talk about that. Now, I mean, there are different kinds of behavioral economics, and I think notch the type of behavioral economics is well, how can I say? I mean, it's too manipulative, I think. Yeah? I mean, it's one thing to understand people's behavior, but I think trying to use these small incentives to push people around within the same boundary, I think that, yeah, sometimes works, but in the bigger scheme of things, sometimes it's much more effective to change institutions and policies rather than, giving these little signals. But, I mean, the school has made very interesting contributions because it tries to understand how people think, I mean, the standard economic theory, neoclassical theory, assumes that we are rational, we are selfish, but then behavioral economists are asking, are we really rational? Yeah? If we are, how much? Yeah? And are we really selfish? Yeah? I mean, are there other motives working? Can you encourage those other things to make people behave in different ways? So yes, it's a very important school. But I think that when it comes to this notch type of discourse, I have some ethical issues. Yeah? Yes, the lady over there.
Hello. Do you consider yourself to belong to a school? And if so, which one?
Right. Yes, the gentleman over there.
Can I speak? Over here?
Oh.
Up to you.
Oh, no, you go.
Okay.
I just raised the question of environmental damage to the planet, and
Yeah.
particularly I'm thinking of carbon pricing, probably the destruction of the rainforests, and just generally climate change. Is it possible for economic practice to actually confront those sort of issues effectively, rather than just playing catch up, which is what we seem to be doing. Never seem to be good enough.
Yeah. Yes.
Hello. One thing that I find is that in economic debate, particularly in the media, there is a lot of discussion around conventional wisdom. And nobody seems to be challenging the big fundamentals of things. Redistribution of wealth, etc. We're all talking about Greeks, Germans, productivity, but nobody's talking about how wealth is distributed and the different ways of doing that. Why do you think the economic class is not really coming out and talking about that issue, which to me is fundamental?
Right. Yeah, thank you for all those questions. They are, in a way, all related. Which school do I belong to? That is actually my problem, no one likes me because I think they are all useful, No, unfortunately, the economists are very sectarian. Yeah? So that the same people, because I said something critical about neoclassical economics, who like me for that moment, if I say something negative about Keynes, because they are Keynesian, they don't like me. So no, but I can honestly tell you that I read as much the Hayek, who is the guru of the Austrian school, extreme supporter of free market, as I have read Marx. So I try to learn from everyone. But having said that, I think I probably have more sympathy for the last three schools than others, but this is the marginal difference. Environmental question, yes, I mean, the economics needs to be changed for us to adequately deal with this. I mean, there are quite a lot of economic tools that we can use to analyze this problem. But for example, if you define people's goal of life as consumption, then you are going to have a problem of producing too much. Yeah? So that we need to bring in these ethical considerations even into economics and say we need to think about different ways of having fulfilling lives. Yeah? So let's look at work, let's look at environment, let's look at community life and so on, rather than just looking at output and consumption. Yeah? So that's one thing that is needed. But also, the analysis of technology that you have in certain branches of economics can actually help you understand the constraints that we have been dealing with the environmental crisis with the help of pure technology, and then it will be helpful in telling you how much of your consumption pattern has to be adjusted and so on. I mean, some economists have very fruitfully used economic tools to analyze how much economic growth can we afford to have in poor countries, because in those countries you need economic growth. In the countries, poor countries with say below $5,000–7,000 per capita income, economic growth is not just about having another iPhone. It's about living and dying. It's about seeing your child live and die. It's about working in a backbreaking job and working in a job that will kill you. So in those countries, economic growth is extremely important. So we need to have. This is where experts come in. I mean, you need those technical tools to figure out exactly how to do this. Wealth and income distribution. I mean, the reason why there's relatively little, if not no, discussion about these issues is, as I said earlier, most economists that belong to the so-called neoclassical school, which do not ask questions about the past. So that their approach is, well, given the income distribution, given the wealth distribution, given the skills people have, how do you make the economy more efficient? So the question itself is excluded from the framework. So you need to bring in other schools to talk about these things. The classical school and the Marxist school, they were very much aware of this problem. So yes, this is why I keep saying that we need to look at different schools together and try to have them cross-fertilize. But believe me, I mean, there are tools in many other economic schools that can deal with those issues. Yeah, maybe one last round. The lady in front.
Does this come on? I have a question.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Just in terms of value, you spoke about gold. How would, and the connection between economics and politics, how would something like Bitcoin, that internet currency, and currency fit into that?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you about the World Bank and the IMF.
Yeah.
Either if you'd been there in the 1940s, how do you think they would have been better structured, or now, how should they be reformed to do a better job?
Yeah, the gentleman there.
Bitcoins, I was going to ask that. Isn't it really energy that makes the economic world go round?
Okay.
And the second part to that is, in view of the fact that I understand we're going to have to let our grandchildren work to clear up the economic mess, shouldn't we leave the energy that they're proposing to get out of the ground by fracking in the ground as a kind of a payoff for that?
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, Bitcoin, in a way, there's nothing new about Bitcoin, because once we have stopped using actual gold and silver as money, we have always used virtual currency. I mean, the pound notes, I mean, it's just paper. Unless people believe that it has worth, just to give you a simple example, try to take it to a country where they have never seen that money, no one will accept it. So in that sense, there's nothing new about Bitcoin. Of course, what is new is that this was tried by, I mean, people who are not controlled by the government. So that's what is new. But I mean, money has always been this social creation, not something physically inherent in gold or whatever. IMF and the World Bank, no, actually, in the early days, they were a lot more kind of accommodating for economic growth, and they were actually, the IMF was initially designed exactly to avoid austerity policies. Now, sometime in the 70s and 80s, it had been taken over by people who believe in the downward equilibrium and austerity and so on. So it has done terrible things, especially in Latin America and Africa in the 1980s and 90s, forcing governments to cut, and destroying the infrastructure, destroying our generation's education and so on. So it has done a lot of damage. Well, fortunately, in the recent period, it has changed for the better a bit. I mean, not enough, obviously, but it has become less obsessed with balanced budget. Actually, even the IMF even criticized the British government and European governments for doing excessive austerity. So I have some hope, but these are huge institutions that they do not change that easily. So let's hope that they go the right way. Well, is energy at the root of economics? Yeah, in a way. I mean, we are material beings. I mean, we need to eat and reproduce and so on, and that requires energy. So in that sense, yes, it's fundamental to economics. And as for your second point, yes, I think that a lot of policies that we have to do in relation to environmental problems should be based on this acceptance that we don't know what is going to happen in the future. For all I know, I mean, despite all the scientific evidence, that global warming may not be as serious as people think it might be. But the trouble is that we don't know, and we cannot, gamble the life of all humanity on this the possibility that it might be okay. So we have to do something, and in this, I suggest that we shouldn't write off the power of technology. In the old days, a wave was just the power of destruction. Now we produce energy out of it. So let's push the government to invest as much in renewable energy as possible. I mean, that doesn't mean that we can then say, yeah, that we can go on as before, but at least that will give us more room for maneuver, more time. But without those technologies, it will be even more difficult to solve this problem, because unfortunately, at least all of us in this room have become used to some degree of comfort, and we cannot live in the way that middle-aged peasants used to live. So implore to you that we shouldn't write off the role of technology in actually solving this problem. Thank you. Okay, I think the time's up. Thank you very much.